Meeting the Shadow by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams from 1991, and also from 1991, Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. It was a good year for shadow work, but it gets even better a few years later with Romancing the Shadow from 1997, and then we need to go to 1998, just 1 year later, for Jung's Map of the Soul by Murray Stein. We then go all the way back to 1980 for Projection and Recollection by Marie-Louise von Franz, and finally some humanistic psychology with Dreamwork by Alvin Mara from 1989. These 6 books normally take my students 6 weeks to work through at a minimum inside of my shadow work library. They have this module that you can see on the screen. This is the lesson plan and practical exercise plan for my shadow work library module 1. These 6 books are the backbone of these exercises, which I'm probably reading through right now. What I'm going to do in this video is speed run the shadow work process, because no matter whether you choose to join me in the shadow work library before the doors close forever on September the 21st, or you choose to stay here on YouTube and you just want to take the books, read them in your own time, I do not mind. I want this information to go into your consciousness and seep in and integrate into your being. We are going to be covering every foundational concept of shadow work in as little time as possible, and by the end of this video, especially if you watched it at 2x speed, you'll be dopaminergically fried, and maybe, ironically, not so capable of actually reading these high-quality books from the 20th century. Let's start with the 3 basic books, though. They're the first 3 that I held up. We have Meeting the Shadow, Owning Your Own Shadow, and Romancing the Shadow. The reason I start my shadow work library experience with these 3 books is you get a broad spectrum understanding of what it means to be doing shadow work. Meeting the Shadow is the kind of book that you need to read if you want 30 to 40 perspectives on how shadow shows up in addiction, in relationship, in terms of old traumas, in terms of delayed procrastinations, in terms of spiritual maladies and spiritual emergencies. This is the Jungian psychology trampoline into further study. And then you'll probably read a more accessible book, like Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson, you may recognize his name from a book like Inner Work or the He, She, We series. He was really prolific back in the 1980s and 1990s. A top read that you need to go into. It will just give you a foundation. And then you go into Romancing the Shadow. This one is particularly interesting because although it's the same author as Meeting the Shadow, or at least the same editor, this one's a lot more archetypally leaning. When you read a book like Romancing the Shadow, you'll go from your personal shadow qualities into the archetypal shadow realm. What I mean by this is it's no longer about you and your personal story. You might be contacting the warrior or the king or the queen or the priestess. You're contacting deeper and higher possibilities within your own psyche because you are a member of the human race, and the human race has collective memory, and there are all kinds of group energetics which go far beyond the ego consciousness. The Shadow Work Library begins with these 3 basic books because these 3 basic books are really the foundation for the next 33 books to come inside of the entire 9-module experience. But let's get into the actual lessons. Starting with lesson 1, which I'm going to bring up now on my phone just so I can keep track with you. The shadow definitions, the territories, entities, and behaviors. This is my personal breakdown and summary of how to teach shadow work in an applicable but also academically grounded way. I was the one that termed shadow territories, entities, and behaviors, although we are drawing upon Carl Jung's work and the various 2nd and 3rd generation Jungians. This particular 3-part breakdown, to my understanding, is my own thing. And it has worked very, very well inside of the Shadow Work Library to give people a practical understanding of their shadow behaviors and who has the behavior, a shadow entity, and where does the shadow entity live in a shadow territory. Let's make this super practical. Shadow work speedrun. Let's imagine you're suffering from a vice such as a drink or drug addiction. We would call that a shadow behavior because the shadow in this concept is not just a singular thing. You might think of shadow work being something about claiming back something or other from the unconscious. That's true, but what in particular are you claiming back? What in particular are you integrating? A shadow behavior is usually the first thing you will notice to realize that something is wrong, and you might have a fragment or a fissure in your psyche which is causing some form of what Jung would call a complex to temporarily take over your personality. If you've struggled with a drink addiction for many years, it would be fair to say that that is a shadow behavior because your central ego consciousness is right here. You then have a higher unconscious, a middle unconscious, and a lower unconscious. This is the psychosynthesis module, which we cover later on in module 8. But for the sake of a simple diagram, ego is in the middle. Shadow behaviors are things like branches, or they're like roots going down that link you towards shadow entities which live in various parts of your higher and lower unconscious. Simply said, the higher unconscious is the territory of the golden shadow, the self-actualization potential that you have yet to materialize and manifest and become, and the lower unconscious is all of the spooky, dark, and shameful things which we typically associate with shadow, but is not exclusively shadow material. You can have a golden shadow, a white shadow, a light shadow. A shadow behavior is a branch or a route that takes you towards the entity. Who is the one that is drinking? It's probably not you in your higher self, your true self, or even your soul. It might not be your ego. I mean, what happens if we open up the ego? You open up the ego. Imagine this is ego, higher, middle, lower unconscious. You open up the ego diagrammatically. What's inside of there? You'd have primary selves and disowned selves. So many different primary selves could be you at various ages of your inner child. It could be you in your adult life. Maybe you have one primary self who is the professional. You have another primary self who's a parent. You have another primary self who's an artist. You start to get a bit archetypal here. But the parts work principle is the very foundation of shadow work. Because if you're contacting a shadow entity, the shadow entity will express shadow behaviors. The drug or drink addict might find at the end of the branch of the shadow behavior of drinking and drugging is an angry, frustrated 17-year-old teenager who just wants to end it all. That would be the shadow entity. And then, well, where does the shadow entity live? Imagine the psychogeography of your own inner world. Where does the 17-year-old you live inside that's drinking and drugging? Well, perhaps it's an abandoned, ruined hotel. Or maybe it's out in the park late at night. Or maybe it's behind the bike sheds at college. I don't know in particular, but this is your psyche. The overall concept of shadow entities, behaviors, and territories is that you can engage with shadow work from 3 different angles from the very beginning. Some people, they know that they want to meet a certain entity. They know that they want to meet their rebellious inner teenager. They know that they want to meet their tyrant king or maybe their deaf mother. There are certain archetypal energies that they've read about or seen on YouTube, and they want to meet that entity right now. And then they'll find out which shadow behaviors are taking over their life and which various complexes are starting to take control, and they'll find out which territory that lives in. Other people, you can approach the territory directly. Territories are 2 main things that, realistically, it's either conceptual or literal. In this case, the adolescent might live in the literal territory of school. So this wouldn't just be the one entity. These are many different entities that could live in the same territory. In the territory of school years, you could have the 3-year-old all the way to the 18-year-old. If you're a teacher like myself, you might even have yourself as an adult in the territory of school. You might have a conceptual territory, for example, the conceptual territory of parenthood, or the conceptual territory of the spiritual life, the spiritual world. Which shadow entities live in your spiritual world? It might be your divine mother, your divine father, your higher self. You can start to break down these concepts in very practical detail, which is why from the very beginning of the Shadow Work Library, we start with this 3-part system of definition, because most people, they will start with the behaviors, and if you then look at the screen right now, we then have how to meet your shadow self, which is the very first exercise inside of the curriculum. Throughout the curriculum, we have exercises to punctuate the theory. This first exercise is making things as immediately practical as possible, because once you understand that you have entities, territories, and behaviors, the best practical way for all of my students is normally to find a shadow behavior or a shadow entity, and then start active imagination and start tracing it backwards. We'll talk about active imagination in just a moment, but if you are already in pursuit of a shadow entity, a particularly difficult part of you, you're already in pursuit of a very problematic addiction-based coping mechanism, maybe spending too much time on your screen, you can use shadow work to really pull back the curtain and find out why that is hurting you in the first place. But then it starts to get even more interesting. We move on to the idea of repression, fragmentation, and projection, and then going into unconscious hooks and projective identification. Repression in itself is the process of basically what gets to be inside of that central ego identity. A disowned self becomes a shadow entity when it passes the threshold from subconscious to unconscious. Imagine this again. In the side of your ego, you might have 5 primary personalities. The person you are at work, the person you are at home, the person you are in relationships, the person you'd like to be, and the person that you were before. And maybe someone that you'd never want to be. There's also a negative primary self, but occasionally 5%, 10% of your week, you get into that scroll-sucking state and you just waste a day, or you go and sleep with someone you shouldn't sleep with, or you don't follow through on something you made a promise to someone. That's still a primary self. It might only be 5% of your life, but that's there. That's all within the ego. what gets to stay in your ego? That's the process there of repression, to repress a certain part of you, to not get too complex on psychodynamic systems. At a certain age, at a certain moment, not just in childhood, but also in adult life, there is a decision made from the conglomerate of primary selves, which are called your ego, maybe with some soul, maybe with some higher self, but usually the conglomerate, the round table of your primary selves, they decide whether or not a part becomes a disowned self, and the disowned self might become a shadow entity. Imagine literally having a friend who then you no longer like because they did something you dislike, and rather than them being at the council of your soul, you say, hey, Billy Bob. Billy Bob is the shadow entity in this particular instance, but he's not a shadow entity just yet, he's a part. Billy Bob's a part of you. You walk Billy Bob out of the room, he's now a disowned self from a voice dialogue perspective, and eventually he keeps walking out further and further into the wilderness, and on the top of the mountain, Billy Bob sits cross-legged, and he has become a shadow entity in the territory of the mountain range, which may also be something that's spiritual. It might be the monk at the top of the mountain meditating. This could be a shadow territory that's literal or conceptual. And he's become a shadow entity because he was repressed and pushed out from the central ego complex. He's still within reach if you make the effort, but he's no longer in the middle unconscious. He's not immediately available to you. You have to make a bit of a pilgrimage, which is where active imagination and inner journeying starts to take place. We also then have the dynamics of projection. The classic shadow work understanding of like, you need to look at your projections, you need to understand how you're projecting onto the world. This needs a bit of technical explanation before we can go any further. What is a projection? From my understanding of projection, projection is a way to close psychic distance between point A and point B. Many of my students love to hate Projection and Recollection by Marie-Louise von Franz, because although she is an OG Jungian thinker, this book was arguably a mistake for me to put into Module 1 because it is a very technical, quite dense, and very academic book. I have a lot of academic books in the curriculum. This one is literally the best book on projection, but compared to a more readable book like Jung's Map of the Soul, which establishes the foundation of all the major terminology, Marie-Louise von Franz, she really knows how to make projection arguably quite dry for some people, but other students have fallen in love with her writing style. One of the major ideas within a book like this is that projection is always automatic. You will never be able to stop projecting. You will never be able to stop automatically disowning parts of yourself and overlaying them onto other people. There are two parts to a projection. There is the one who is, well, three parts, I suppose. The one who is projecting, that is the I, the self, the part, or the entity. You then have the projection itself, which is launching across space, and for the projection to land on something, there needs to be a hook. Imagine that old cowboy game with the horse saddle where you do the ring toss. Remember back in the 1820s, I'm sure you were there, just like me. Back in the 1820s on the Western frontier, you had the horseshoe, and you had the metal beam, and you had to like, boom, and you had to land it on the beam. The horseshoe is the projection. The metal beam is the hook. A projection will not land on somebody if the hook is not there, which doesn't necessarily mean that when you're projecting that someone is an evil dictator or someone's going to betray you and backstab you, that they are indeed that because the hook's there. The size is not necessarily what you're seeing correctly. A projection will launch across psychological distance because you don't have all the information to be able to make an assessment of what you're encountering in the outer environment. Projection is a natural and automatic function of the psyche, which will never stop. You're walking down the street, you see a gang of youths, you project this might be potentially an unsafe situation in a way that you don't if you see two children holding hands and skipping down the street singing Kumbaya. You have different automatic projections based on your personal history and various archetypal influences, which we'll leave for later, and you project that across the literal distance of how far away you are on the street. You throw the shoe, it lands on the hook, and guess what? You might be 100% right, but you could be 100% wrong. Those two skipping children going down the street, maybe they just got back from setting 10 different buildings on fire, and maybe they're singing their way towards the 11th, and maybe the gang of youths have just come back from the kitten shelter, and they've just found a way to donate extra amounts of money from their charitable efforts. You don't know. You just don't know. Nonetheless, the hook is something worth focusing on. The hook in you and the hook in them needs to exist for a projection to land. If a homeless, deranged person on the street were to come up to you and say that you're stupid and idiotic and you're worth nothing, you probably won't have that much of a reaction unless you have a hook within your own heart of self-hatred and negativity. If I go down the city street and someone says, I'm a so-and-so, and I just don't, whoosh, whoosh, it goes over me. The horseshoe goes all the way over my head because the hook isn't there to land. But if I had the negative, shame-based identity construct inside of myself, guess what? It lands. The hook can be large or small, though. This is where the dynamics really get interesting in terms of how you trip yourself up in fantasy projection, or various hate bonds, which are basically a series of pseudo-conflicts between different false selves, the false self within you, the false self within them. You shadow box across time to form an adversarial symbiosis. I covered this in Module 3 of the Shadow Work Library. I'm not going to go into it in great detail right now. The hook itself can be different sizes. You can have a small hook, which carries a big projection. It hangs just on the tip. Imagine, whoosh, massive horseshoe, lands just on the tip like this. Or you have a tremendously large hook, and it can carry the horseshoe with ease, and maybe take 10 different horseshoes because you are indeed that kind of person. A projection can be positive or negative. I receive countless amounts of projections every single month in my comment section and in my messages because I've decided to be a public figure. Many of the projections that I get are positive. Sometimes they're a bit too positive. They lean towards pedestalization, in which case I've got a small hook, let's put it this way. For ease, I've got a small hook of being competent and authoritative and a very charismatic speaker who's also rather witty at times on YouTube videos, and the positive projection of, wow, you're amazing, Jordan, thank you so much for the video. That lands quite nicely on there. But in some cases, I get massive hooks of like, you're the best teacher ever, even better than so-and-so famous teacher. This massive hook dangles on the end, but guess what? It will fall off. It's not real because it's an artificial pedestalization, and I'm not vulnerable to the grandiosity complex in particular, in the same way that on the other side of the story, if a demonization comes in, recently I've had comments of people calling me the biggest evil, like charlatan, scammer, I don't know what I'm talking about. That happens on a week-by-week basis because pedestalization and demonization are two sides of the same delusional coin. Reality typically happens in the middle zone of emotional intensity, but if someone is deeply repressed inside of themselves, a particularly aspirational aspect, for example, them being a public teacher, a public influencer, they might positively project onto those they watch on YouTube. Alternatively, if you have a side of you which is a deep scammer kind of personality, or maybe you have a shadow behavior of taking advantage of people, guess what? You're going to be looking out in the world for that which you have disowned inside of yourself. And you are likely to launch in the comment section very large, overblown, paranoid, hostile, hate bond fueled projections, and you are trapping yourself in a world of delusion and pain. Let's move on to the next lesson now. We're looking at the complex of why do shadows become patterns. According to Carl Jung, a complex is a series of emotionally charged sensations, images, and narratives which can functionally serve as a semi-autonomous, semi-permanent, semi-transparent idea or identity itself when it takes over you. To say that simply, a complex is a series of emotionally charged memories and associations from personal history and also collective history, which can take over you as if they were a person. And that is why complexes can become so difficult. You've heard of the mother complex, or the father complex, or the savior complex, or the martyr complex, or maybe something like Peter Pan syndrome. What's going on here? We've got a series of different associations. We have books in Jung's Map of the Soul in particular. This one goes into this in great detail. Any particular set of associations become bound together and they take on a series of psychic gravity. Imagine that your psyche is a planetary system and you have one asteroid. This asteroid is called Avoiding Responsibility. That enters the planetary system. There's a gravitational field. It's now going around. Avoiding responsibility. It's going around and around. And then we have excessive blaming of others. That goes around and around. They're kind of similar though. They're kind of similar, not yet binding together. Avoiding responsibility, blaming others, they kind of go in together. We then have excessive clinging towards parental figures. We've now got 3 asteroids coming in all together, and maybe a 4th asteroid comes in, and guess what? This is the inability to finish things that you started. All 4 of these asteroids gravitating around the center of your own psyche, in which case this is your ego. That then starts to gravitate and then condense into something called, for the sake of this example, Peter Pan syndrome. You get what I'm saying here. Various particularly charged situations, various behaviors, shadow behaviors, even various shadow entities or shadow territories, they combine and condense to become their own thing, which seems semi-autonomous. So when someone is run by a complex, they are basically run by a series of quite individual things that have all come together to create the appearance or illusion of a solid psychological subject. Hopefully you follow what I'm saying there. It means that when you're working on something like a mother complex, which maybe means you're codependently attached to your mother, you're in your 30s or your 40s, you're still calling her every single week, you're still asking her for answers to problems that you don't need to ask her about. There is a way to unravel the complex, and that means finding a way to take out one asteroid at a time and dismantling the moon of the complex so that it can leave your solar system. Bit of an astrological metaphor there, but that's basically how you work with complexes in a practical sense. There is a bit more complexity with the archetypal complex, which is bringing in the mother as an archetype. So you then have the divine mother, you then have the smother mother or the toxic mother, or maybe the avoidant mother. This is where things get a bit more, a bit more of an issue, but you can start here. You can use this model that I'm presenting to really unravel major relational patterns. And practically, if you do this work, you'll start to feel like all of your energy is back inside of you. It takes a hell of a lot of psychological work to keep all of these various complexes working around the orbit of your identity. And occasionally they crash into you, you get displaced and you get fragmented, and guess what? It takes a while to find your feet again. You're fundamentally moving through a variety of false selves or shadow entities that take on a bit too much power at the table, and the shadow work in this very first module of the shadow work library is figuring out from a diagnostic perspective who's inside of my psyche, how do they get there, what are the behaviors, where are the territories, how do they all gravitate and condense together, and how can I start to rip it all apart? And then once it's floating in space, maybe I want to push some of them away. I don't want that one. I don't want avoiding responsibility. Being codependently attached to my mother, that one needs a big push. And then you enter into a territory of space. You quite literally end up a bit floaty. You don't necessarily know who you are. You don't really feel like you've got a solid sense of self. But that's where you then get the possibility for deep spiritual work and developing a soul-based connection to your higher self and fundamentally seating yourself in something like what Assagioli would call a transpersonal will or transpersonal self, rather than merely the ego who's running the show. This is something for another day, but that's the big win. Let's now look at the golden shadow question right here on the screen. The golden shadow: are you allergic to self-actualization? Imagine you're in the space of spaciness and you want to try and be someone who's better than you were before, but you have an allergy towards your potential because you had various conditioning from mother or father, brother or sister, auntie or uncle, or maybe a school teacher that you shouldn't try, you shouldn't push. Who do you think you are? That's not for people like us. Stop looking in that window. We'll never be able to go there. You get the idea. Golden shadow allergies are inherited or internalized, or accurately, introjected projections from usually parental figures. A golden shadow allergy is basically you putting a cap on your higher unconscious. Remember, higher unconscious, that's the clouds and where the branches reach towards the heavens. This is where your divine old man or old woman, your king or your queen, these kinds of figures, they live up there. They're in power, they're in sovereignty, they have autonomy and strength. But you might have put a cap on your own higher unconscious, and you can't do anything more than squeeze your head in. I mean, literally imagine this. To see who you are and your kingly or queenly self, you need to, at the very least, get your eyes above the threshold and go, wow, it's bright up here. It's too much. I'm going to go back down, go back into the darkness. In fact, actually, I feel a bit more comfortable going all the way down. I'm going to go down to my shadow tyrant energy. This moment here of getting out of the repressive band from a somatic and kind of bioenergetic perspective, you can literally get bands around your head. That's why people get headaches and strain. Why do you feel so tense in here? Maybe before you have a big meeting, which could be a massive opportunity, or a new interview, you suddenly get a tension headache. You suddenly self-sabotage. What's happening? To some degree, it's the equivalent of going out into the sun and being unprepared and being blinded by your own light. That is something which is a major problem, and I've systematically helped many of my students, 130 of them at this point, move through golden shadow blockages and golden shadow allergies, and I see predictably and repeatably they get into sovereign consciousness, they start being more soul-based, and fundamentally, it was never their allergy to begin with. It was a parental worry. Almost always it was a parental concern, because a parent had a certain type of conditioning where maybe they were punished or maybe they failed in life, and they don't want the child to make the same mistake. They were trying their best to shame the child. Shame in itself is a tool that's a mistaken attempt to rise consciousness. I teach this elsewhere, but shame is a tool to bring someone to the same state of consciousness you have. Unfortunately, unfortunately, many of our parents are at lower stages of consciousness than maybe we would like to be, so their idea to do good education is to bring you up to quite a black and white thinking, whereas you want to be more pluralistic and more holistic, more integral. That's where the shame complex starts to become quite an issue with the golden shadow in particular, but it is possible to become more of a self-actualizing individual, especially if you're willing to work in a group and share your dreams with people who are also quite nervous to share their dreams, but they know they need to expand and self-actualize as well. Let's move on to the second exercise now in the module, right here on the screen. How to find your golden shadow with a few questions. There are a few ways to do this. Simply said, for a shadow work speedrun, look at the people you admire. Right now, get a piece of paper, swap over to the notes on your phone. Do you have 5 people that you watch on YouTube who you admire or you watch frequently because they are inspiring individuals? Do you have celebrities or public figures, political figures, or maybe creative visionaries who you likewise find inspiring? Put them on this list. Any historical figure. The people that you look up to, the men and women who you admire, carry your disowned golden shadow. For whatever reason, repressive barrier, projection launches towards them. They have the literal hook because they're literally talented, they're literally competent, they're literally beautiful and amazing. Their hook lands appropriately and it stays there. But what would it be like if you unhooked the hook and you withdrew that projection back to you? The question I would want you to ask yourself is, what are the particular qualities or attributes in this man or this woman that I would like to have in myself? What is it about them that is truly inspiring, and why, perhaps, do I feel the shame of not being them? What is the gap between the pitiful self that I am and the brilliant self that I see in them, and why can I not stop paying attention? It's because you want that. You want to be that. Look at who you watch on the internet. Why are you still watching this deep into YouTube? I know from a technical point of view, it's because I represent at least one golden shadow quality, because you don't pay attention to things that you don't value, and the golden shadow is the epitome of a high value structure. It's in the higher unconscious, the highest values from self-actualization theory, from Abraham Maslow. This would be meta motivations and meta needs. The B values, the being values, beauty, truth, goodness, perfection, dichotomy, transcendence, wholeness, unity. You get the idea. People take on these traits, and you might have a bit of a shimmer and a shine towards why they have it and you don't have it, but ask yourself that question again. In the journaling exercise, I break it down in great detail. Who are they, and why am I paying attention, and what does that mean about me and what I'm moving towards? Let's now go towards the practical perspective on dream work and active imagination. Once again, I would want you to read a book like Alvin Mara's Dreamwork. This is a classic book with meticulous detail about how to go into your inner worlds. Fundamentally, the active imagination state is a waking daydream with conscious influence. To meet your shadow entities, to discover their shadow behaviors, and to walk through their shadow territories that they occupy, you need to go into an altered state. When you dream at night, you are permanently in an altered state if you remember your dreams. A daydream is an active imagination because you're activating the same parts of your brain, more or less, but you're doing it with intention and you are starting a conversation. We then get to the next point of, well, not only getting into dream work and active imagination, but finally, how do we talk to our shadow entities? I want you to remember this. Final points for the video. You talk to a shadow entity as if they were a real person, and you treat them with respect, and you let your intentions be visible. Do not go into your inner world. You have the rebellious 17-year-old who's drugging and drinking in the forest or the abandoned warehouse. Don't go in and say, hey, what are you doing? Stop doing that, like you're an angry parent and you're repeating the trauma all over again. Go in with respect. You don't need to be overly pleasing. You don't need to be pandering around. It's like, hey, sorry, I'm sorry that I'm here. I don't want to bother you. Like, just take that syringe out of your arm. There, it's all okay. You don't need to do that. Like, you go into the space and say, hey, I'm here to meet with you. Are you available to talk? And they might not talk initially, in which case you can read the body language and you can just get the scene. Talk to them and be with them like a real person. This sounds crazy if you've never done it, but when you really go into proper, guided, active imagination, and this is parts work with a Jungian twist, you will find answers, and you can even do things like creating pledges and promises and asking directly, hey, 17-year-old rebellious me, what would you need to see in my adult life right now to stop needing the drink and the drugs? And you might be shown a vision. Maybe you need a better romantic relationship. Maybe you need to change your job. Maybe they don't like the way that you dress or the way that you're treating your body with your diet. All kinds of things can come out of any particular shadow entity, and it is your responsibility to listen. For the sake of a single shadow work speedrun, I want you to remember that you are in control, and even though you is something of a nebulous concept, you do have the ability to go much deeper into the complexity of your own psyche if you take a systematic approach and at the very least read these 6 books that I've held up for free on YouTube in the Shadowwork Speedrun. You don't need to join me in the Shadowwork library. Here's 6 for free, but if you do want to join me and you've liked this kind of comedic take on what normally takes people over a month, then do click the link in the description, because just like this one, just like this, I'm going to put it up on the screen, there are all the modules. Link in description, you can see every single lesson within every single module and go, do I want to join the Shadowwork library before the doors close forever on September the 21st at a discounted rate of £800? Yes or no? It would be my pleasure to welcome you inside. This has been a bit of a fun video. I'm open and available to conversation. The Shadowwork library has been an exceptional experience for me to teach, and hopefully you've enjoyed this one-take, teaching from the heart, rapid-fire dopaminergic dump of Shadowwork material. And I do just remind you, no matter what you do, joining me in the library, coming to join the seminars on Sundays, building personal relationship, or just staying with the books, just take the next 110 days until the end of the year seriously. You've got about a week to decide if you want to work with me, but you have got several months to decide if you're going to make the most of 2025. Your shadows need not consume you. You can start the next year from a place of clarity, a place of golden shadow actualization, withdrawing the projections, healing the fragmentations, and becoming the kind of man or woman that you find inspiring and you feel proud of. That self-love, that respect and compassion starts from within. And from within, you must know that you are more than a single thing. And that's where shadow work is useful. If you want to work with me personally and directly, and you've enjoyed the way I've spoken about this, then let me apply my brain and my care towards you in particular in the weekly seminars and private voice note exchanges. Link is in the description. You've got 7 days to decide.